Let's tell the story of Zechariah chapters 7 and 8. But before we get to Zechariah 7 and 8, we have to back up 3,400 years ago, all the way back to when the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, this is the opening story of the book of Exodus, and we read that the Egyptians have enslaved the Israelites for 400 years. 400 years of enslavement. And after 400 years of crying out, God decides to liberate the Israelites from their oppression with a mighty and miraculous hand, and God leads them out of Egypt into the wilderness before the promised land. Now, while the Israelites are in the wilderness, they are a nomadic people. So you can imagine that their architecture reflects their nomadic way of life. We specifically read about one building in particular, the most important building in Israelite culture during this era, which is the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle is described in detail in Exodus chapter 25 to 40, and what happens is God asks Moses and the Israelites to build this tabernacle. Now, if we were to look at the floor plan of this, because I'm an architectural nerd, you can see that we have two rooms that are inside this tent right here. And the bigger room, the room that most people enter in through, is the holy place, and the more interior room is called the most holy place. Which means that if there was a third room between these two, it would probably be called the more holy place. You're welcome. Anyways, here in the most holy place is where they placed the Ark of the Covenant. And thanks to a documentary film I saw recently, we know exactly what the Ark of the Covenant looked like. The documentary film I'm talking about is Raiders of the Lost Ark, which portrayed the Ark of the Covenant looking exactly like this. Now, what most Christians and even some Jews do not know is the fact that all the way back in Exodus chapter 25, God explains what is supposed to happen around the Ark of the Covenant. Specifically, God says to Moses, "There I will meet you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the Ark of the Covenant, I, being God, will deliver to you all my commands for the Israelites." In other words, in the most interior room of this tent is the intersection of the human and the divine, the intersection of heaven and humanity, the intersection of where God meets humankind and gives them laws that they are to keep. So Moses and the Israelites work hard on completing the tabernacle, and at the end of Exodus, we read the tabernacle's completed. Then a cloud comes down and covers the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now this brings the book of Exodus to a close. We turn the page to the book of Leviticus, which is a bunch of rules, and God speaks to Moses from the tabernacle and says a bunch of rules. So this all sets the stage for Leviticus, and the whole idea is that God meets humankind in the most holy place while sitting on the Ark of the Covenant. Now think about what this architecture represents as far as a theological idea. You have this idea that no matter where you wander toward or where you set up camp, you can set up a tent and God will be there. So this is a rather revolutionary idea for the time, because what this architecture is ultimately saying is that God is with us wherever we go. Now, 400 years after the tabernacle is completed, about 3,000 years ago, there were 12 tribes of Israel who were in the promised land, and there was one man from the tribe of Benjamin named Saul who did what he could to unite the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, you take 12 tribes of Israel and you consolidate them into one nation. Yes, I said consolidation, and I make no apologies for that joke. That's what Saul did. Now, Saul was violently overthrown by a man named David, who many consider to be Israel's greatest king. And then David's son Solomon took the throne after David passed away. Now, Solomon had dreams of empire. He wanted to make Israel into a powerful nation with a strong economy. So he looked at the fact that God was residing in a mobile and impermanent tent, and he says, you know what? We are no longer nomadic people. We need to build a more permanent structure for God because this is where our land is. So Solomon got to work, and Solomon built the temple over 7 years. Now, the temple is the permanent architecture of what the tabernacle was before. I like these artist rendering because they don't usually most artist rendering you see are from architectural languages that are much later than this period would have allowed. But here we look at what Solomon's temple might have looked like. And the interior was head to toe from ceiling to floor covered in gold. But at its very core, there were still 2 rooms, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the holy place before it. And if you look at this cross section here, you realize how extra Solomon was, because not only is this covered in gold, but Solomon created 2 more angels, or 2 more cherubim, that stood over the Ark of the Covenant, and these angels, these cherubim, were over 15 feet tall each, and they were just covered in gold. So you can imagine there's this box in the most holy place where God sits, and it's being dwarfed by these massive sculptures of angels on either side. So Solomon dedicates the temple, and you can imagine how this changes the theological idea, because before it was, no matter where we go, God will be with us. But now that we've got a foundation, and we've got stones, and we've got this stuff in brick and mortar, and it's sitting there forever, you can see how the theological idea shifts to God will always be here with us. And we can always count on finding God right here. So it moves from a nomadic people to an empirical people, and people go to Jerusalem and they find this permanent structure, and it changes the theology of what it is. Yes, there's still God on the mercy seat giving laws, but ultimately it changes the way that God moves and functions. Now, this temple stood for about 400 years, and people thought it would stand forever. The problem was there was a superpower rising to the east known as Babylon, and in 586 BCE, they launched an attack on the city of Jerusalem, which is where the temple was. Now, as this attack was ongoing, the people of Jerusalem assumed that God, being the most powerful God, would come to their defense because God would not allow God's own house to fall. But they were stunned when the Babylonians took over Jerusalem, conquered it, and destroyed the temple in front of them. Not only that, but the Babylonians forced the survivors to leave Jerusalem and made them live in exile with the hopes of assimilation in an effort to wipe out Jewish culture and Jewish traditions. Now, a prophet who was looking back on this event later talked about where God went and why God didn't defend God's own house. That prophet's name was Ezekiel, and in chapter 10, he writes about it by saying, "Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house." In other words, Ezekiel says, God left us to fend for ourselves in the face of the Babylonians. Now, this is a bit hard for Christians in America to understand today. You'd have to really try to concretize the whole of our religion into one structure and watch the whole of one's religion be destroyed to understand the despair and uncertainty and hopelessness that many Jews felt 2,500 years ago. The closest parallel that I can come up with is imagine that there was some superpower that invaded us, murdered a bunch of our own people, and then eventually started systematically destroying every copy of the Bible until there was no Bible left. That was the equivalent, although it still has some limitations in the metaphor, to what was happening in 586 BCE. So the question it raises is, what would you do if someone physically destroyed your entire religion? Because that is a lot of the questions that the Jews were facing in 586 BCE. So the Babylonians took the survivors, they forced them to live in exile in 586 BCE, and a theological question arose. How long, O Lord, will you allow us to languish in exile? Now, to that question, a prophet named Jeremiah came along, and rather than speaking in abstract terms, just very point blankly said, it will be 70 years. You're going to have to sit in Babylon and live in Babylon for 70 years. This is our punishment because we were not devoted enough to God. So we're going to take a 70-year timeout, and then God will restore us. Now, here's what's interesting. People really bought into this 70 years kind of idea. And 47 years later, which is punishment year 47 of 70, something rather strange happened. The Persians rose from the east, led by Cyrus the Great. They attacked the Babylonians and defeated the Babylonians in Babylon. Cyrus invades Babylon. He looks around. He looks at the people from Judah and he says, "Where are you guys from?" And they say, "We're from Judah." And Cyrus says, "You are free to go back as long as you pay taxes." The people of Judah are elated because they were paying taxes to the Babylonians anyways. So they return to Judah and they are demoralized to return to a city of rubble, including the rubble of the temple. And they look around at this city that is laid waste to, and they look at themselves and they start to say, "We must rebuild our country." And so they get to work, and it's hard work. It takes years. And 19 years into this rebuild, punishment year 66 out of 70, they start looking around at where they are and they start saying, it's been 66 years. Shouldn't God be a little farther along in our restoration process? And if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, you know that this is the question that is the backdrop behind Zechariah's prophecy that we are studying through the month of July. And Zechariah answers this question because people are saying like, "Hey, I thought God was going to restore us in 70 years. What happened?" And so Zechariah's thesis in response to this question is he writes, "Return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you." And what Zechariah proposes is the idea that this 70-year punishment doesn't just automatically come to an end. Instead, you have to earn your way out of it. You are not entitled to restoration. We have to create something new that warrants restoration. And so he talks about different things. He has a bunch of visions. He gives ideas for what that looks like and what work the people of Judah can do. And 22 months later, punishment year 68 of 70, the temple is being rebuilt. It's going poorly. It's really hard to rebuild things. People are frustrated, but it's getting closer. When two people, Sherezzar and Regem-Melech, approach Zechariah and they ask him a very, very simple yes or no question. They ask him, "Should we mourn and fast in the 5th month as we have done for nearly 70 years? So what happens is these two guys go to Zechariah, a prophet, and they say, "Hey, we've instituted this ritual since the temple was destroyed. You know, we fast during the day for an entire month to remind ourselves of the grief we feel for the destruction of the temple. Are we going to keep doing that once the 70 years come to a close in 2 years?" And Zechariah hears this simple yes or no question, and he responds with several questions. Among those questions are, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th month and in the 7th for these 70 years, was it for God that you fasted? And when you eat and when you drink, do you not eat and drink only for yourselves? To which I picture these two guys saying, so that's a no? Is that what you're trying to tell us? But Zechariah just keeps on going. In verses 9 and 10 of chapter 7, Zechariah says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another." He then goes on to add more lists of things that can be done for greater justice. And I picture these two men hearing all of this and saying to themselves, what? And Zechariah goes on for the rest of chapter 7 into chapter 8, and he says, "Thus says the Lord, I will return to Zion and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts shall be called the holy mountain. Old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of their great age. And the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets. Even though it seems impossible to the remnant of the people in these days, should it also seem impossible to me, being God? I will save my people from the east country and from the west country, and I will bring them to live in Jerusalem. They shall be my people." To which the two guys hearing all of this, going on for chapters, probably responded by saying, "That's great, but can you answer our question?" It's a simple yes or no. And after going on about justice again in verses 10 to 18, Zechariah then finally answers their question after a lengthy preamble. He says in verse 19, the fast of the 4th month, and the fast of the 5th, and the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th shall be seasons of joy and gladness and cheerful festivals for the house of Judah. Therefore, love truth and peace. So after a very long preamble, Zechariah finally answers Sherazar and Regem-Melech's question. The answer to their question is no. We don't have to keep doing these festivals or these fasts of grief that happen for an entire month. And after finally answering their question, Zechariah wraps up chapter 8 by talking about how all of the nations will come from far and near and celebrate with Jerusalem in these new festivals. And that's the end of Zechariah chapter 8. What a strange story. Two guys ask Zechariah for an answer to a yes or no question. He speaks for 2 chapters uninterrupted before finally answering, and then says, basically, we're going to throw a big party and everyone's invited. What does this have to do with us in 2020, when mass parties are a frightening proposition? Well, I think there's 3 things that we can learn from this story, from Zechariah chapter 7 and 8. And it involves the history that I shared with you, it involves the story behind this story, and then it involves the story itself. So if we go back to the history, and this date in 586 BCE, back when Jerusalem was destroyed, you have to really empathize here with the Jewish people and with Jewish history. Because this story is a story about a national trauma. People die in this story. And just when it seems like it can't get any worse, all of a sudden, the Babylonians start attacking the temple and they destroy the temple, and prophets start telling you, hey guys, God abandoned us. And we have to really empathize with that trauma to understand the weight and the power in Zechariah's words. Because if you skip that part of the story, when this question comes forward and they ask, well, should we keep mourning for these 70 years when we're done? Or once the temple's rebuilt, can we move on? This question doesn't really seem to have any significance or any meaning. Because how we deal with grief is really important. And we have to acknowledge that the Jewish people put into their rituals, into their religion, a ritual that gave them space to grieve collectively. Now, this matters a great deal in 2020 in the United States of America, because as of this date, as of yesterday, I just checked Johns Hopkins' website, we have over 138,000 Americans who have died due to this pandemic, due to this disease specifically. This is a national trauma. And I don't want to say that this is the exact trauma that the Jewish people faced 2,600 years ago. I don't want to get into who suffered more or anything like that. Both of these stories are stories about national trauma, where we are experiencing trauma as a country. And we're all going through this right now in America together. Now, what's interesting about this is that normally one of the ways that we cope with trauma is we spend time together. But that's really complicated by this virus. And when it comes to a church and how a church processes trauma, we get together and we share our trauma with each other in order to talk about how we can process things and to be validated in the midst of our pain. And as I've talked to you, and as Pastor Mandy has talked to you over the internet, over phone calls, any way that we've reached out, one thing that's become apparent to the pastoral staff at Paradox is that our church and our members are experiencing a lot of anxiety right now, aren't we? We're experiencing a lot of anxiety. I mean, you want to talk about anxiety. My wife and I, just this past week, spent an entire week almost talking about whether or not we were going to send our daughter to first grade in a classroom or not. And there are pros and cons to both, and trying to weigh physical health with mental health. It was exhausting. It was an anxious conversation. And as I've talked to you about the different things that you are facing, it's very apparent that all of us are experiencing anxiety. Now, back when we used to meet in person, I would speak on a stage, and I think that a lot of people like hearing a pastor speak on a stage because they have in their mind that this pastor is a little bit closer to God. And so maybe if I can just learn from this guy that's a little closer to God, then I can learn how to cope with my anxiety because he apparently has it all together. But I have to tell you, that's not true. And the person that I've heard express this better than just about anybody else is a comedian named Bo Burnham, who did a Netflix special in 2016 called Make Happy. Now, this Netflix special is really funny. I find it personally hilarious. And he ends this whole special by going on a Kanye West-inspired rant by talking about his problems. And his two biggest problems are the fact that Pringles cans aren't wide enough to put your hand in, and the other is that when he goes to Chipotle, the people making the burrito don't have any idea of how much stuff should go in the burrito. Those are his two biggest problems. And it's really funny. It's a really funny comedy bit. And in the midst of this, it's all set to music, and it's to verse and song and has rhymes. He all of a sudden breaks it down, and he's like, let me tell you what my real problem is. He's like, I feel a lot of pressure from the expectations you bring to a show. And he sings this line, and it really meant a lot to me, which is, come and laugh at the skinny kid with the steadily declining mental health, and laugh as he attempts to give you what he cannot give himself. And then he goes back to talking about Pringles cans and Chipotle burritos. It's like this moment in the middle of a comedy special. And I tell you this because I want to be very upfront about who I am. I am not the model of mental health, particularly during this pandemic. And if you came to church this morning hoping that I could give you a cheat code for how to cope with your anxiety, I don't have any cheat codes. Look, this week has been rough for my anxiety. It's been rough for my depression. It's just been rough. And not just this week, but the last several months. And I can't really give you a cure-all where all of a sudden, snap, your anxiety and your uncertainty is gone. And I don't have that. And if I ever appear to have it, I'm not trying to deceive you. I'm just doing like you are, and I'm just trying to get through the day, right? I don't think church, in particular Paradox Church, exists to give you cheat codes through the hard things that you find in life. Instead, I hope that what we create together is, I hope that this church can create a space for you to grieve. And I hope that you can grieve not in isolation, but grieve in community. I hope that if you have anxiety, that we can talk together in community about that anxiety, and to realize that we stand in solidarity with you with that anxiety, and we work to deal and manage and work through our anxieties, but we don't believe in a quick fix cure-all here. And when I look at this story rooted in the history, the thing I'm impressed by is the fact that there was a grieving ritual built into the religion to deal with the national trauma. I hope our church can be that grieving ritual in the way that we lament together, and the spaces we create can be a place that we can communally grieve so you don't have to grieve in isolation. So the first thing that we can learn from Zechariah 7 and 8 is that we need to grieve. We have to create space for grieving. We have to grieve in community. We have to grieve by ourselves. But grieving is an important part of this process when dealing with a national trauma. And we get into a lot of trouble when we refuse to call it a national trauma and we refuse to grieve. Which brings us to the second thing that we can learn from Zechariah 7 and 8. Here we have a question: should we mourn and fast in the 5th month as we have done for nearly 70 years? Now, Zechariah gives a giant preamble. And I have to tell you, reading this book is different if you trust that Zechariah is either inspired or brilliant. Because he knows that if he says just, no, we don't have to do those anymore, he misses an opportunity to talk about what these things actually mean and what matters in religion. After all, he answers this question with a long rant about justice, about how we need to show kindness and mercy to each other, how we need to make sure we don't oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and how we must constantly think about the well-being of the person who is next to us as well as ourselves. Now, he says this while the temple is being constructed. And what's interesting is Zechariah doesn't answer their question by saying, no, we don't have to grieve anymore because we're rebuilding the temple. And if we rebuild the temple and it's there, then why would we have a ritual where we grieve the fact that the temple's been destroyed? That would seem to be the most logical answer. But Zechariah doesn't do that. Instead, he kind of is like, the temple's there. It's fine. You know, it's nice. It's nice to have a temple. But I don't think the temple is the point. And while it's easy to read this in isolation, when you look at the history, you realize what's actually happening here. Because here you have a temple where the presence of God is right there. And you can imagine if this is destroyed, it calls into question whether or not God exists. And the story and the testimony and the beauty of the Jewish tradition is that there is a paradox at the heart of this faith when you consider what this story and this history and this trauma is telling us. Because here Ezekiel says, God abandons us. And yet when you keep reading Ezekiel, he talks about what God is doing. When you read Jeremiah, he talks about God abandoning God's people. But then Jeremiah talks about what God is doing with God's people, even in God's abandonment. So this paradox that's at the heart of the prophetic tradition is that even when God abandons us, God is still with us. Let me show you how this actually helps in America today. I've often spoken to people who have said things like, I'm going through a spiritual dry spell, or I'm in the desert, or I'm not feeling that close to God anymore. Now, most churches you go and talk to the pastor about this, and they'll tell you one of three things. They prescribe you one of three practices that you're supposed to do to reconnect with God. One is make sure you attend church every week. 2 is read your Bible every day. And 3 is develop a robust prayer life. And they would say if you practice these disciplines or these rituals regularly, you will feel closer to God. Now, you may disagree with what I'm about to say, and that's fine. But Zechariah, I believe, would hear these 3 suggestions and say, these practices are fine, but it's not what really matters. It's cool that you have a great prayer life, but I don't think that's the ultimate marker of faith. Instead, I think it's much more important in the way that you act and treat other people around you and how you fight against injustices. Because when we consider what's happening here in America today, this pandemic is exposing injustices in our public health. Both people who can't afford it, the way that we react and treat people who can't go to work because of this pandemic, the way that we empathize and understand people who are in power and when they make mistakes and how we shift things. This pandemic is exposing a lot of different injustices in our public health system and the way that we hold these things together. And so Zechariah would point out that it's important for us to grieve. Yes, those rituals that we built into our religion are important. However, when we talk about potentially moving on from those grieving rituals, we must always then take the next step, which is to pursue justice, to work toward a better reality than what we had before. And we have to make sure that we take care of the orphan, the widow, the poor and the powerless, and we have to make sure that we care for each other before we answer the question of if we should move on from these grieving rituals. So for Zechariah, he prioritizes the need for humankind to pursue justice. Which brings us to the third thing that we can learn. And this third thing is revealed once again in that question, which is, hey, should we keep practicing or doing these rituals? And Zechariah gives a rather surprising response to the grieving rituals. The answer ultimately is no, we should stop those. Instead, we should just have more parties. Now, we would assume that Zechariah would say, once the temple is completed, then we should have more parties. But instead, Zechariah's like, why wait until the temple is finished? There's plenty to celebrate right now. Now, if you're like me, you hear Zechariah saying, hey, let's just have more parties. And you're like, oh man, parties are really getting us into this mess of the pandemic. I mean, the fact that we can't shut down parties is the problem. And I used to have that attitude, and I still feel that on some level. So just hear me out, because I'm going to tell you a story that happened just a couple weeks ago. I got a call on Thursday night, a text message on Thursday night, asking if I'd be interested in doing a wedding on a Saturday. I said, sure, when is it? And they said, oh, it's in 2 days. It's like this Saturday. And I said, what? And they said, hey, this is a friend of a friend of a friend. If you'd be willing to talk to them, you can hear what's going on, and you can see if you'd be interested in doing it. So the next day, I talked to the couple on the phone, and they tell me their story. And their story is this. They were planning to get married in 2020, and they had to delay their wedding because it was a spring wedding. They had to delay their wedding because it was in the spring. They delayed it to the summer. They had to delay it again, and then they were looking at it being in October, and they realized they were going to have to delay it again. And just 2 days before they talked to me, they decided they were going to get married that Saturday because, they were excited about getting married. And as I talked to them, this couple told me that they were going to meet in a backyard. There weren't going to be more than 12 guests there, plus me and a photographer. And I said, yes, I would do it. And so I showed up to this backyard to this wedding that nobody knew was going to happen on Monday, and it was on a Saturday. And I was a little on edge to be there because I haven't done a lot of public gatherings. I mean, this barely qualifies as a public gathering, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. And this couple was just really cool also. But I'm standing up there, and the first bride walks in, and the second bride walks in, and my heart just starts to fill with joy and happiness. And you know what it's like. You know what it's like when you go to a wedding and a couple is just truly, genuinely happy to be getting married. And Marissa and Karen, I didn't actually meet until this moment when they walked down the aisle. They walked up, and I'm like, hi, my name's Craig. It's nice to meet you. And I was a little scared I would call Karen Marissa and vice versa, but we made it through it. I think I did it only once or twice. But it was just one of those weddings that was just so happy, and the family was thrilled that this couple was getting married. I mean, we celebrated, we cheered. I mean, this is what the wedding looked like. And it was this moment that nobody knew was coming. And it was just beautiful. And it was a wonderful, wonderful wedding. This wedding cake was, they had this wedding cake and they cut it. And wouldn't you know it, when they cut it open, it was a pride flag. What? It was awesome. Just awesome. And I got to be part of Karen and Marissa's wedding, a couple that I had never met before the altar other than talking to them on the phone. And it was just a privilege to be a part of because there was so much joy in the middle of a crazy pandemic. And this wedding for me was an oasis of joy. And I remember going home and talking to my wife about it and just being like, it was so great. They had this, people were happy, everyone was there. It was just such a great time, Kimmy. And she looked at me, she's like, you're really fired up about this. And I said, yeah, I am. Because I haven't been to a wedding in a long time. And it was just a celebration. And when we look at what's happened to Americans right now in the middle of this pandemic, we have lost our rituals of joy, haven't we? We've lost them. Like, birthday parties are complicated now. Weddings are complicated. A lot of them have been delayed. A lot of them are smaller. I mean, just going over to somebody's house is complicated. Some people do it, some people don't. But rituals of joy in our life have become very few and far between and are not anything like what we knew before. And when you look at what Zechariah is telling these two men who are saying, what should we do with these rituals of grief? He's trying to tell them, like, we have to start doing parties because we've been grieving for so long that we have to celebrate what's good now. And so the third thing that we can learn from this story is that we need to enjoy. And I've got to put a real caveat out there, just like Zechariah did so long ago, because he talked about justice before enjoyment. And I think the reason there's that long preamble is because Zechariah would say to us, open your eyes to the injustice of public health that's happening right now and the blatant disregard for others' well-being. Pay attention to that first and foremost, and then figure out your rituals of enjoyment. Because I think what Zechariah is saying is that we commit a sin whenever we pursue joy at the expense of justice. Whenever we say, oh man, I deserve spring break the way we've always had it, I think Zechariah would call that a sin. Whenever somebody's like, oh, it's Memorial Day weekend, we deserve it the way we've always had it, it's a sin. But instead, I think Zechariah would ask us to think creatively about the rituals of joy we have and to reimagine what those rituals look like and how we participate in them and prioritize those rituals, but never at the expense of justice. I want to tell you about 3 quick rituals to wrap up that I've been able to reimagine and be part of. It's just meant to hopefully help you reimagine your rituals of joy, and we'd love to hear what your reimagined rituals of joy are as well. One ritual that my wife and I participate in frequently before COVID was we went to Caprice Cafe, which is our favorite restaurant in Redlands. I mean, just, in my opinion, the best food in the Inland Empire. And, you know, it's not the same not being able to go there, but we got takeout from there recently. And it's like there was this normalcy that returned, even though we couldn't sit in the restaurant. And it was a real small thing, but it's just amazing how much this restaurant has participated in all of the celebrations that we've been a part of, birthdays, anniversaries. And to taste that food again brought us back to a state of enjoyment. And it just had to happen at home instead of in a restaurant. Another thing is my wife's birthday was last month, and this is us on her birthday. And I asked her what she wanted to do for her birthday, and she said to me, Craig, I just want to be with our friends again. And in my head, I'm thinking, that's the one thing we can't do, but we'll figure something out. And so we planned a moving birthday party where we went to different friends' house. I had a timer of 5 minutes, and we drove from friend's house to friend's house to friend's house, and they would sing happy birthday, they would ask questions, and then we'd get in the car and go to the next place. Now, if you're one of our friends and we didn't make it to your house, we had to discriminate some based on zip codes, so we weren't driving around for 4 hours, because that would be fun. But we just want you to know that we still love you and wanted you to be part of this celebration. But this is a reimagining of a way to do a birthday party. It's not perfect, but this is what it would take, where we don't cheat justice in order to reimagine a ritual of celebration. One thing that we missed out on that just won't be able to replace is my daughter graduated from kindergarten. And we asked my daughter, what do you want to do to celebrate your graduation? And she said, I want everyone to dress up so we can take pictures together. Why? Have you tried dressing up during the pandemic? It is painful. So we did it for my daughter. And of course, she didn't want to take pictures as soon as we put all these clothes on. And that's just the way parenting goes. But it was all worth it because we got this picture, which I love. And it's not the same. And I don't think it's supposed to be the same. Just like that wedding was not the same as what it was supposed to be. We brought people in via Zoom. There's going to be other parties. There's other things that will happen. It's not the same. But can we reimagine this joy and prioritize this joy without cheating justice? Because yes, this story that we are facing right now is about a national trauma. But this story is also about the human spirit and how we respond to this trauma with empathy, kindness, a pursuit of justice, and ultimately, joy. I believe that when you consider the history of this story and what Zechariah says, it is a balance between justice and joy and grieving that we find God. And so, to my brothers, my sisters, my siblings, my wish for you this morning is that you may find God in tears, justice, and laughter. May you see and embrace Jesus Christ in all.